The morning fog rolled across the sand waterfront as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her navy blue uniform one last time. She stood outside the Veterans Affairs office, her heart pounding against her chest. The gold trident pin gleamed on her chest, catching the early sunlight. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her small apartment mirror, perfecting the stance, the walk, the 1,000-yard stare that she imagined all Navy SEALs possessed. Sarah wasn't a Navy SEAL. She had never even served in the military. But desperation had driven her to this moment, standing on the precipice of a lie that would either save her life or destroy it completely. 3 months earlier, Sarah had been living in her car, having lost her job as a waitress when the restaurant closed down. With no family to turn to and pride preventing her from seeking help, she had stumbled upon a disturbing truth about how society treated its veterans. At a soup kitchen, she had watched as a man in a tattered army jacket was ushered to the front of the line, given extra portions, and treated with a respect that seemed foreign to her own experiences of being invisible and dismissed. That night, sleeping in the backseat of her 1998 Civic, Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. She would become someone who mattered, someone who commanded respect, someone who had served. The transformation hadn't been easy. Sarah spent weeks at the public library, researching everything she could about the Navy SEALs. She learned about Bud S training, Hell Week, the different SEAL teams, and the culture of the elite warriors. She memorized terminology, studied the rank structure, and even watched countless documentaries and YouTube videos of former SEALs telling their stories. Her first purchase had been the uniform from a military surplus store. The elderly owner had barely looked up from his newspaper as she selected the items, paying cash from the last of her savings. The trident pin had been harder to acquire, finally found on an online auction site. She had hesitated before clicking "Buy Now," knowing that wearing it without earning it was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But hunger has a way of eroding moral boundaries. The first time she had worn the uniform to apply for veterans' benefits, her hands had shaken so badly she could barely fill out the forms. But the clerk had simply thanked her for her service and expedited her application. Within days, she had a small apartment through a veterans' housing program and food assistance that meant she no longer had to choose between gas for her car and eating. The guilt had been overwhelming at first. Every "thank you for your service" felt like a knife twisting in her gut. But as weeks turned to months, Sarah found herself growing into the role. She walked differently, talked differently. She created an elaborate backstory about her time with SEAL Team 3, carefully crafted from the research she had done. She claimed her records were classified, which conveniently explained why she couldn't provide detailed documentation. The veterans community had embraced her with open arms. At the VA hospital where she received free health care, other veterans would nod respectfully when they saw the trident. Some would approach her, wanting to share their own stories or simply shake the hand of someone they considered a hero. Sarah would listen, offering the kind of understanding nod she had seen in the documentaries, playing the part of the quiet professional who had seen too much to talk about it. She found work through a veterans job placement program, landing a position at a security company that prioritized hearing former military. Her supervisor, a former Marine, had been impressed by her bearing and what he perceived as her tactical mindset. The job paid well, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt financially stable. But the lie grew heavier with each passing day. She had to constantly be on guard, careful not to slip up in conversations with actual veterans. She spent hours each night studying military culture, memorizing details about bases she had supposedly been stationed at, operations she might have participated in during the she claimed to have served. The worst moments came when she encountered actual Navy SEALs or those who had worked closely with them. At a veterans fundraiser, she had nearly panicked when introduced to a retired SEAL commander. But she had managed to deflect his questions by claiming that her experiences were too classified to discuss and that she preferred to keep a low profile. The commander had seemed to respect this, even praising her for maintaining operational security. Sarah developed a routine to maintain her deception. She worked out religiously, knowing that physical fitness was a hallmark of SEALs. She kept her hair short and neat, practiced the 1,000-yard stare in the mirror, and cultivated an air of quiet intensity. She volunteered at veterans events, always being helpful but never putting herself in the spotlight. The other veterans she met trusted her implicitly. There was an unspoken bond among those who had served, and Sarah found herself both honored and horrified to be included in it. She listened to their real stories of sacrifice, of friends lost in combat, of the physical and mental scars they carried. Their authenticity made her deception feel even more monstrous. One evening, at a support group for veterans with PTSD, Sarah sat in a circle as a young Marine broke down crying, describing the loss of his squad in Afghanistan. Without thinking, Sarah had reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering the comfort of someone who understood. The Marine had looked at her with such gratitude, such recognition of shared pain, that Sarah had excused herself and vomited in the bathroom, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her lies. But she couldn't stop. The practical benefits were too important: the health care, the housing assistance, the job that paid enough for her to save money for the first time in her life. But beyond that, she had become addicted to the respect, to being seen as someone who mattered. After years of being invisible, of being just another struggling person in a city full of them, she was somebody. She was a hero. Sarah began to believe her own lies. She would wake up some mornings almost convinced that she really had been through Bud-S, that she really had served her country. The fictional memories she had created became more vivid with each retelling. She could describe the cold Pacific water during training, the weight of her gear during operations, the brotherhood of her team, all constructed from videos and books, but feeling more real with each passing day. Her at the security company looked up to her. They would ask for her advice on tactical situations, and Sarah would respond with insights gleaned from her extensive research. She became known as someone cool under pressure, someone who could handle any situation, traits she had consciously developed to fit the image of a SEAL. The transformation extended beyond just her professional life. Sarah found herself adopting the values she had read about in SEAL memoirs: integrity, honor, courage. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was living these values while perpetrating a massive fraud. She volunteered more, helped other veterans navigate the system, and even mentored younger veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. At night, alone in her apartment, the weight of the deception would crash down on her. She would stare at the trident pin, knowing that real SEALs had bled and suffered for the right to wear it, while she had simply purchased it online. She would think about the veterans she had met who had lost limbs, who battled PTSD every day, who had watched friends die, and here she was, stealing their valor for her own benefit. She tried to rationalize it. She wasn't hurting anyone, she told herself. She was actually helping other veterans through her volunteer work. The system had failed her when she needed help, and she had found a way to survive. But the justifications rang hollow when she looked in the mirror and saw the uniform that she had no right to wear. The closest she came to being caught was at a Navy birthday ball she attended with some veterans from her support group. A retired Admiral had been the guest of honor, and when he had shaken her hand, his eyes had lingered on her face with an expression she couldn't read. He had asked her a few questions about her service, which she had answered with her practiced vagueness about classified operations. The Admiral had nodded, but something in his eyes had made her nervous. After that encounter, Sarah had considered ending the charade. She could claim she was leaving town for a job opportunity, slowly extract herself from the veterans' community and start over somewhere else as herself. But the thought of returning to invisibility, to poverty, to being nobody, paralyzed her. She had tasted what it was like to be respected, to be valued, and she couldn't give it up. So she doubled down on the deception. She studied harder, worked out more intensely, and became even more involved in veterans' causes. She convinced herself that if she helped enough real veterans, it might somehow balance out her stolen valor. She became an expert at deflecting specific questions about her service, always citing operational security or simply saying she preferred not to relive those memories. The months passed, and Sarah's false identity became more entrenched. She had a good job, a nice apartment, health care, and a community that respected and valued her. She had everything she had ever wanted, built on a foundation of lies. But lies have a way of catching up with their tellers. Sarah's carefully constructed world began to show cracks when she was invited to speak at a high school career day about military service. Standing in front of those young faces, being presented as a hero and role model, something inside her broke. She managed to get through the presentation, but afterward she sat in her car and sobbed. She knew she couldn't keep living this way. The guilt was eating her alive, and the fear of being discovered grew stronger every day. She had heard stories of people being prosecuted for stolen valor, of the public humiliation and legal consequences. But more than that, she couldn't bear the thought of the veterans who had become her friends learning the truth. They had shared their deepest traumas with her, believing she understood because she had been through the same crucible. Sarah began to plan her exit strategy. She would save enough money to relocate, then gradually withdraw from the veterans' community. She would claim burnout, a need to get away from reminders of her service. It wouldn't be unusual, many veterans struggled with civilian life and needed to distance themselves from military culture. But before she could put her plan into action, fate intervened. At a fundraiser for wounded veterans, Sarah found herself face to face with the Admiral she had met months earlier at the Navy ball. This time, his scrutiny was more intense and his questions more pointed. He asked about specific training locations, about people she might have known, about operations during her supposed of service. Sarah felt the walls closing in. She gave her practiced responses, but she could see the skepticism in the Admiral's eyes. He excused himself, but she noticed him making a phone call, his eyes never leaving her. Panic set in. Sarah made an excuse about feeling ill and left the fundraiser early. She drove home, her mind racing. Should she pack up and leave town immediately? Should she try to brazen it out? The Admiral couldn't prove anything, could he? She spent a sleepless night weighing her options. By morning, she had decided to stay and maintain her cover. Running would only make her look guilty. Maybe the Admiral's suspicions would pass. Maybe he would decide he was wrong. But 3 days later, Sarah's world came crashing down. She was at work when 2 federal agents arrived, their credentials identifying them as investigators with the FBI. Her supervisor, the former Marine who had hired her, watched in shock as they asked to speak with her privately. In a small conference room, the agents laid out what they knew. The Admiral, it turned out, had extensive connections and had made some inquiries. There was no record of a Sarah Mitchell ever completing Bud S or serving with any SEAL team. Her story didn't check out. Sarah sat in stunned silence as the agents explained the charges she was facing. Fraudulent enlistment, wearing unauthorized military decorations, theft of government benefits meant for veterans. The Stolen Valor Act made her actions a federal crime. The agents were not unkind. They seemed to understand that desperation, not malice, had driven her actions. But the law was clear and the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's carefully constructed identity crumbled in that small conference room. As they prepared to arrest her, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of relief mixed with the terror. The weight of the lies, the constant fear of discovery, the guilt that had gnawed at her, it was all over. She no longer had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. The walk out of the building in handcuffs was a blur. She could feel the eyes of her, people who had respected her, looked up to her. The betrayal and confusion on their faces would haunt her. The former Marine supervisor looked particularly stricken, and Sarah realized that her deception had violated the sacred trust that existed among those who had served. At the Federal Detention Center, Sarah was processed with the same efficiency as any other defendant. The uniform that had been her armor, her identity, was replaced with jail clothes. The trident pin was taken as evidence. She was no longer a Navy SEAL, no longer a hero. She was just Sarah Mitchell, facing the consequences of her choices. The other inmates were a mix of people accused of various federal crimes. Some recognized her from news reports that had begun to surface about her arrest. "Fake SEAL arrested for stolen valor," the headlines read. The story had gone viral, with veterans groups expressing outrage and calling for the maximum penalty. Sarah's public defender, a harried young woman named Jennifer, reviewed the case with growing concern. The evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was strongly against Sarah. Videos had surfaced of Sarah at veterans' events, wearing the uniform, accepting thanks for her service. The prosecutor was pushing for significant jail time as a deterrent to others who might consider similar fraud. But Jennifer saw something in Sarah that gave her pause. This wasn't a typical con artist. Sarah hadn't sold fake military medals or scammed people out of money. She had been homeless, desperate, and had found a way to survive that happened to be illegal. The fact that she had used her false identity to help other veterans complicated the narrative. As Sarah sat in her cell awaiting trial, she had plenty of time to reflect on how she had gotten to this point. The journey from homeless woman to fake Navy SEAL to federal defendant seemed surreal. She thought about all the real veterans she had met, the stories they had shared, the trust they had placed in her. She wrote letters of apology that she knew she could never send. How could she explain to the young Marine with PTSD that the person who had comforted him was a fraud? How could she face the veterans who had welcomed her into their community with open arms? The media attention was relentless. Sarah became the face of stolen valor, her story dissected on cable news and social media. Veterans groups called for harsh punishment, while some advocates for the homeless pointed to her case as an example of how desperation could drive people to extreme measures. In jail, Sarah kept to herself. She attended counseling sessions where she began to unpack the complex emotions that had led to her deception. The therapist helped her understand that her desire for respect and belonging, while human, had led her to violate the trust of people who had earned that respect through genuine sacrifice. She also began to understand the deeper harm of her actions. It wasn't just about the benefits she had fraudulently obtained. She had undermined the public's trust in veterans, potentially making it harder for real veterans to get the recognition and support they deserved. Every person who wore a uniform would now face additional scrutiny because of people like her. 3 weeks into her incarceration, Jennifer brought unexpected news. The Admiral who had exposed her had requested a meeting. Admiral James Richardson, retired, wanted to speak with Sarah before her trial. Sarah was transported to a meeting room in the federal courthouse, her hands and feet shackled. She had researched Admiral Richardson after their first encounter, a decorated SEAL with multiple combat deployments, now an advocate for veterans' affairs. She couldn't imagine what he wanted to say to her. The Admiral entered the room with a bearing that immediately commanded respect. Even in his civilian clothes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. His eyes, when they met Sarah's, were unreadable. He sat across from her, studying her for a long moment before speaking. His first words were not what she expected. "I've been looking into your background, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but penetrating. "Not your fake military history, but your real one. Foster care, abuse, homelessness. You've been fighting for survival your whole life." Sarah felt tears threatening but held them back. She had expected anger, disgust, maybe even threats. Not this. The Admiral continued, "What you did was wrong, deeply wrong. You violated something sacred to those of us who served. But I've also learned about what you did with your false identity. The veterans you helped, the volunteer work, the young people you mentored." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to excuse what you did, but I am here to understand it, and maybe to find a way forward that serves justice without destroying any chance you have at redemption." Sarah found her voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know that's not enough, but I am so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to survive, and then I got lost in it." The Admiral nodded. Stolen valor cases usually involve people trying to impress others or gain undeserved recognition. Your case is different. You stole an identity to survive and then tried to live up to it. That doesn't make it right, but it does make it complicated. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "I've spoken with some of the veterans you helped. The Marine with PTSD you counseled, the elderly Navy veteran you drove to appointments, the Gold Star families you comforted. They're angry about the deception, yes, but some of them have also asked me to consider the good you did." Sarah was stunned. She had assumed universal condemnation from the veteran community. "I've also spoken with your public defender and the prosecutor," the Admiral continued. "There's a possibility of a plea deal that includes significant community service with veteran organizations, under supervision and with full disclosure of your past, of course. You would serve time, but not as much as the prosecutor originally wanted, and you would have a chance to make genuine amends." "Why?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "Why would you help me after what I did?" The Admiral was quiet for a moment. "Because I've seen what desperation can do to people, and because I believe in redemption. You can't undo what you've done, but you can choose what you do next. The question is, do you want to make this right, really make it right, or do you want to just serve your time and disappear?" Sarah felt something shift inside her. For months, she had been running from the truth, and even now, caught and facing justice, she had been focused on survival. But the Admiral was offering her something different, a chance at genuine redemption. "I want to make it right," she said, and meant it. "I know I can never really make up for what I did, but I want to try. I owe it to every real veteran I deceived." The Admiral studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Good. It won't be easy. The community you betrayed will be watching, and many will never forgive you, but some might if you show genuine remorse and commitment to making amends." He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Ms. Mitchell, you spent months pretending to embody the values of a Navy SEAL. Now you have a chance to actually live those values: integrity, honor, courage. The difference is, This time it will be real and it will be hard-earned. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the meeting room, processing what had just happened. She had expected justice to come in the form of punishment, and it would. But Admiral Richardson had shown her that justice could also include the possibility of redemption. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal negotiations. The plea deal the Admiral had mentioned materialized, though it came with strict conditions. Sarah would plead guilty to all charges, serve 6 months in federal prison, pay restitution for the benefits she had fraudulently obtained, and then spend 3 years on probation with 2,000 hours of community service specifically focused on veteran organizations. But there was more. As part of the deal, Sarah would have to publicly apologize to the veteran community and participate in a documentary about stolen valor, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. She would have to face the people she had deceived and own her actions completely. Standing in court for her sentencing, Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Veterans filled the gallery, some wearing their uniforms, others in civilian clothes, but with the bearing that marked them as those who had served. She saw anger in some faces, disappointment in others, and in a few, a grudging willingness to listen. When given the chance to speak, Sarah didn't use the prepared statement her lawyer had helped her write. Instead, she spoke from the heart, acknowledging the depth of her betrayal, the sacred trust she had violated, and the harm she had caused not just to individuals but to the integrity of military service itself. "I stood among heroes while being a fraud," she said, her voice breaking. "I accepted thanks for service I never gave, respect I never earned. I listened to stories of real sacrifice while living a lie. There is no excuse for what I did, and I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask for the chance to spend the rest of my life trying to undo some of the harm I've caused." The judge, a veteran himself, was stern in his sentencing, but acknowledged the unusual nature of the case. He emphasized that stolen valor was not just about wearing unearned medals, but about betraying the trust of those who had genuinely served and the civilians who honored that service. As Sarah was led away to begin her sentence, she caught sight of Admiral Richardson in the gallery. He gave her a single nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. She had taken the first step on a very long road. Federal prison was nothing like the movies had prepared Sarah for. The Women's Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, was a low-security facility, but it was still prison. The first night, lying on the thin mattress in her cell, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to process how her life had led her here. The sounds of the prison at night, distant conversations, footsteps on concrete, the occasional sob from another cell, created a symphony of consequence. Her cellmate was Maria, a woman in her 50s serving time for tax fraud. Maria had been in for 2 years already and knew the routines, the unspoken rules, the ways to survive without becoming either predator or prey. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "So you're the fake SEAL," Maria said on that first night, not unkindly but with the directness that prison seemed to inspire. "Your case was all over the news. My son's a Marine. He wasn't happy about what you did." Sarah nodded, unable to find words. What could she say? Sorry seemed inadequate for the magnitude of her deception. "But he also read about why you did it," Maria continued. "Said it was different from the usual stolen valor cases. Said you were homeless, desperate. Doesn't make it right, but makes it human, I guess." That small bit of understanding, from someone whose own family had served, meant more to Sarah than she could express. She had prepared herself for universal hatred in prison, especially given the nature of her crime. The military was respected even among criminals, and she had violated that respect. The days in prison fell into a routine. Wake-up call at 6 a.m., breakfast in the communal dining hall, work assignment, lunch, more work, dinner, and then a few hours of what passed for free time before lights out. Sarah was assigned to the kitchen, spending her days preparing and serving meals to her fellow inmates. It was in the kitchen that Sarah met a former Army medic serving time for prescription drug theft. Had heard about Sarah's case and initially kept her distance, but gradually they began to talk during their shifts. Had served 2 tours in Iraq and bore both physical and mental scars from her service. "You know what pisses me off most about what you did?" asked one day as they prepped vegetables for dinner. "It's not the benefits you took or the lies you told, it's that you had a choice. You chose to put on that uniform. I didn't choose to watch my friends die. I didn't choose to come back broken." Sarah absorbed the anger, knowing she deserved it. "You're right," she said simply. I had a choice and I made the wrong one, I'm sorry. Studied her for a long moment. Yeah, well, sorry doesn't bring back the respect you stole, but I heard you're planning to make amends when you get out. That true? It's true, Sarah confirmed. I have 2,000 hours of community service with veteran organizations, plus the documentary, the public speaking about why stolen valor is wrong. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. Good, said, returning to her work. Because every fake soldier makes it harder for the real ones to be believed. The conversation stuck with Sarah as she continued her daily routine. She began to understand that her crime had ripple effects she hadn't even considered. Every veteran who had to prove their service, every person who now looked at military uniforms with skepticism, every real hero whose story was doubted because of frauds like her, she had contributed to all of that. In the prison library, Sarah spent her free time differently than most inmates. While others sought escape in fiction or worked on legal appeals, Sarah immersed herself in military history and veteran affairs. But now, instead of mining these resources for details to support her lies, she read to truly understand the experiences she had falsely claimed. She read memoirs of real SEALs, but now with a different perspective. The pain, sacrifice, and brotherhood described in those pages took on new meaning when she wasn't trying to appropriate them. She read about PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, the suicide epidemic among veterans. She studied the history of stolen valor and its impact on the military community. One book particularly affected her, a compilation of letters from Gold Star families, those who had lost loved ones in service. Sarah had met such families during her time posing as a SEAL, had accepted their gratitude for her service, while their children, spouses, and parents lay in graves around the world. The magnitude of her betrayal hit her anew as she read their words of loss and pride. She began writing in a journal, not the fabricated stories she had once created, but real reflections on her actions and their consequences. The prison therapist had suggested it as a way to process her guilt and plan for her future. Sarah found herself filling notebook after notebook with thoughts she had been afraid to confront. I wanted to be seen, she wrote one night. I wanted to matter, but I made myself matter by stealing from those who had earned their place through sacrifice I can't even imagine. How do I live with that? How do I make amends for something that can never truly be amended? 2 months into her sentence, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Jennifer, her public defender, came with news and a proposal. The documentary filmmaker who wanted to feature Sarah's story had reached out. He was a veteran himself, a former Marine who had served in Afghanistan, and he wanted to create something more than just a cautionary tale. He wants to explore the deeper issues, Jennifer explained. Homelessness among women, the failures of the social safety net, how desperation can lead to choices we never thought we'd make. But he also wants to show the real harm of stolen valor, give voice to the veterans who feel betrayed by it. Sarah was hesitant. Participating in the documentary was part of her plea deal, but the prospect of having her story dissected on film, of facing cameras and questions about her lowest moments, terrified her. But she remembered Admiral Richardson's words about living the values she had only pretended to embody. Courage meant facing this. I'll do it, she told Jennifer. But I want to make sure the focus is on the harm I caused, not on excusing what I did. And I want real veterans to have their say, especially if they hate me for what I did. The first interview was conducted in a stark room at the prison. The filmmaker, Torres, was a soft-spoken man whose calm demeanor belied the intensity of his questions. He didn't let Sarah off easy, pressing her on the details of her deception, the moments when she could have stopped but didn't, the specific veterans she had deceived. Tell me about the first time you put on the uniform, said, his camera capturing every emotion that crossed Sarah's face. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that morning. I threw up, she admitted. After I put it on, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I knew it was wrong. Every fiber of my being knew it was wrong. But I was so hungry, so tired of being invisible. I told myself it was just for one day, just to get some help. But one day became a week, became a month, became a life built on lies. Asked about specific incidents, and Sarah forced herself to relive them with honesty. The Marine with PTSD she had comforted, the Gold Star mother who had hugged her and thanked her for her service, the young people who had looked at her as a role model. Each memory was a knife twist of shame. How do you reconcile the good you did while living this lie? Asked. The veterans you helped, the volunteer work. I don't, Sarah said simply. Good actions don't erase the fundamental betrayal. If anything, they make it worse because I used them to justify continuing the lie. Every veteran I helped while wearing that uniform I hadn't earned, it was just another layer of deception. The interview sessions were exhausting, but Sarah committed to complete honesty. She knew that veterans would watch this documentary, that some of the people she had deceived might see it. She owed them the truth, however painful it was to tell. Back in her cell after the interviews, Sarah often found herself drained. Maria, her cellmate, noticed the toll it was taking. "You're punishing yourself harder than any judge could," Maria observed one evening. "It's not enough," Sarah replied. "It'll never be enough. How do you make up for pretending to be someone who risked their life for their country? How do you apologize to people who lost friends in combat while you were playing dress-up?" Maria was quiet for a moment. "You can't make up for it," she said finally. "But you can make sure you're not the same person who did those things. That's all any of us can do, be better than we were." As her sentence progressed, Sarah found unexpected allies among some of the inmates. Word had spread about her commitment to making amends, and while not everyone forgave her crime, some respected her willingness to face it head-on. She started teaching literacy classes to other inmates, using skills she had developed during her months of intensive research. The former Army medic gradually warmed to her. They began having deeper conversations about military service, about the challenges veterans faced, about the complex relationship between those who served and the society they protected. "You want to know the ironic thing?" said one day. "The way you describe feeling when you wore that uniform, respected, valued like you mattered, that's how a lot of us felt when we first enlisted. Kids from nowhere, suddenly part of something bigger than ourselves. The difference is we earned it through sacrifice." "I know," Sarah said. "That's what makes what I did so unforgivable. I took a shortcut to something that has no shortcuts." "No, you don't know," corrected sharply. "You can't know. You can understand intellectually, but you'll never know what it's like to earn that uniform, and that's something you'll have to live with." Sarah nodded, accepting the harsh truth. It was these conversations, difficult as they were, that helped her understand the full scope of her betrayal. It wasn't just about lying or taking benefits. It was about cheapening something sacred, something that people had died for. 3 months into her sentence, Sarah received a letter that surprised her. It was from the Marine she had comforted in the support group, the one whose breakdown had sent her running to the bathroom in shame. His name was Tyler, and his words were both angry and complex. "When I found out you were a fraud, I felt violated," he wrote. "I had shared my darkest moments with you, thinking you understood because you'd been there too. To find out it was all a lie, I can't describe the betrayal I felt." Sarah had to put the letter down, overwhelmed by the pain she had caused. But when she picked it up again, Tyler's tone had shifted. "But I've been thinking about it a lot. The comfort you offered, fake or not, helped me through a dark time. The advice you gave came from research, not experience, but it was still good advice. I'm angry and I may never forgive you, but I wanted you to know that your deception, wrong as it was, inadvertently helped save my life. I don't know what to do with that contradiction." Sarah wrote back, a long letter acknowledging his pain and confusion, taking full responsibility for the betrayal while being grateful that something positive had come from her actions, even if undeserved. She didn't expect a response and didn't receive one, but the act of writing, of facing someone she had directly harmed, was part of her journey toward accountability. The documentary filmmaker returned several times, each visit delving deeper into different aspects of the story. Interviewed other inmates who were veterans, getting their perspectives on stolen valor. Their responses ranged from rage to pity to a complex understanding of how desperation could drive someone to such extremes. "She's not the enemy," one former soldier said on camera. "The enemy is the system that leaves people so desperate they'll steal honor they didn't earn. Doesn't excuse what she did, but maybe it explains it." Another veteran inmate was less forgiving. "There are lines you don't cross," she said firmly. "Homeless, get help, hungry, there are programs, but don't you dare put on a uniform you didn't earn. Don't you dare claim sacrifices you didn't make." Sarah watched these interviews when showed them to her, absorbing every word of criticism and grudging understanding. She was particularly moved by an interview with a Navy SEAL who had served with distinction and was now in prison for a drug-related offense. "The trident isn't just a pin," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It represents every evolution of Hell Week, every mission, every brother lost. When someone wears it without earning it, they're not just lying about themselves. They're disrespecting every man who died wearing it. These words haunted Sarah. She had known intellectually that the trident was sacred to seals, but hearing it from someone who had earned it, who was now in prison himself but still held that symbol as holy, drove home the sacrilege of her actions. As her release date approached, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. Prison had been hard, but in some ways it had been simpler than what awaited her. In prison, she was paying for her crime in a clear, defined way. Outside, she would have to navigate the complex process of making amends to a community she had betrayed. Jennifer visited to discuss the plans for Sarah's release and probation. The community service had been arranged with several veteran organizations, though some had refused to work with her. She would start with organizations focused on homeless veterans, where her own experience with homelessness might provide some authentic value. "You'll also need to register for the public speaking circuit," Jennifer explained. "Part of your plea deal involves speaking at high schools and colleges about stolen valor, explaining why it's wrong and harmful." Sarah nodded, understanding that this would perhaps be the hardest part. Standing in front of young people, admitting to her deception, exposing her shame publicly again and again. But if it prevented even one person from making the same mistake, it would be worth it. The documentary was nearly complete and showed Sarah a rough cut. Watching herself on screen, seeing her story laid bare was excruciating, but had done a thoughtful job, neither excusing her actions nor demonizing her. He had woven together the threads of desperation, deception, and the possibility of redemption. The film included interviews with real SEALs, including Admiral Richardson, who spoke about the sacred nature of military service and why stolen valor cuts so deep. But he also spoke about redemption, about the possibility of making amends, about a society that sometimes failed its most vulnerable, and how that failure could lead to desperate choices. "She committed a serious crime," the Admiral said on camera. "She betrayed the trust of those who served, but she's also committed to making amends in a way I've rarely seen. Whether the veteran community will accept those amends remains to be seen, but the effort must be acknowledged." Sarah's last weeks in prison were spent preparing for the challenge ahead. She worked with the prison's reentry program, planning for housing, employment, and the structure of her probation. The fame, or infamy, from her case meant that finding regular employment would be difficult. Everyone would know who she was and what she had done. But there were unexpected offers of help. A nonprofit focused on women's homelessness reached out, saying they would be willing to employ her in an administrative role, believing her experience could help her connect with their clients. It was a chance to use her real experience of homelessness, rather than her fake military service, to help others. On her last night in prison, Sarah lay in her bunk, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. 6 months earlier, she had been living a lie, wearing a uniform she hadn't earned, accepting honor she didn't deserve. Now, stripped of all pretense, faced with the full weight of her actions, she was paradoxically more authentic than she had been in years. Maria, who would be released a few months after Sarah, offered some final words of advice. "The world out there isn't going to be kind to you," she said. "Your crime is the kind that makes people angry in a special way, but you've got something many of us don't, a clear path to redemption, even if it's a hard one. Walk it with your head up, not with pride, but with purpose." The morning of her release came with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Sarah packed her few belongings, including the notebooks filled with her reflections and the letters from both supporters and critics. She said goodbye to and the other inmates she had come to know, particularly the veterans who had challenged her, educated her, and in some cases, offered a grudging respect for her commitment to accountability. Pulled her aside for a final conversation. "I'm still angry about what you did," she said bluntly. "But I've watched you these past months. You're not the same person who put on that uniform. That doesn't erase what you did, but it matters. When you're out there speaking to kids, telling them why stolen valor is wrong, remember the veterans who can't speak for themselves anymore. Honor them by making sure no one else does what you did." Sarah promised she would, and she meant it. As she walked through the gates of the prison, she didn't feel free. She felt the weight of the work ahead, the years of community service, the public speeches, the documentary that would ensure her shame was preserved for posterity. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose that, ironically, was more genuine than anything she had felt while wearing the stolen uniform. Jennifer met her outside with a change of clothes and a folder full of paperwork related to her probation. The first stop was the probation office, where Sarah would receive the ankle monitor she would wear for the first year of her release. It was a visible reminder that her debt to society was far from paid. As they drove away from the prison, Sarah watched the landscape change from the institutional grounds to the normal world she would now have to navigate as a convicted felon, a woman known for stolen valor, a person seeking redemption for betraying those who had served. "Are you ready for this?" Jennifer asked, glancing at her former client with concern. Sarah thought about the question seriously. Ready to face public scorn, ready to stand before veterans and admit her betrayal, ready to spend years trying to undo the harm she had caused, ready to live with authenticity after months of living a lie. "No," she answered honestly. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I owe it to every veteran I deceived, every person whose trust I betrayed. I may never be able to make it right, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." The city came into view, and with it, the complex world Sarah would have to navigate. No longer the fake Navy SEAL, no longer the respected veteran. She was now just Sarah Mitchell, convicted felon, cautionary tale, and woman seeking redemption. It wasn't the identity she had wanted, but it was real, and that was a start. Her first stop after probation was the homeless shelter where she had once sought refuge before her deception began. She had arranged to volunteer there as part of her community service, coming full circle to the place where desperation had first planted the seeds of her crime. The director, aware of her history, had agreed to give her a chance. "Your story could help others," the director had said during their phone conversation while Sarah was still in prison. "Not because what you did was right, but because you can speak to the desperation that drives people to desperate choices. And maybe, just maybe, you can help someone choose differently." Standing outside the shelter, Sarah took a deep breath. Inside were people like she had been desperate, invisible, looking for any way to survive. She couldn't undo her past, but she could use it to help others avoid her mistakes. It wasn't heroism, she had forfeited any claim to that when she put on the unearned uniform. But it was honest work, and after months of lies, honesty was all she had left to offer. The homeless shelter smelled exactly as Sarah remembered, a mixture of industrial disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar scent of desperation that seemed to cling to places where hope was in short supply. Standing in the intake area, wearing the ankle monitor that marked her as a probationer, Sarah felt the weight of irony. Less than a year ago, she had walked out of a place like this wearing a stolen identity. Now she was back, stripped of all pretense. Washington, the shelter director, was a woman in her 60s who had seen every kind of human crisis walk through her doors. She studied Sarah with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the ankle monitor, the nervous posture, the way Sarah's hands kept clenching and unclenching. "So you're the one," said, not unkindly but with the directness of someone who had no time for games. "The fake SEAL. I've got to tell you, when your probation officer called about placing you here for community service, I almost said no." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Why didn't you?" "Because I've been doing this for 30 years and I've seen what desperation can make people do. And because," paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think your story might help some of the women here make different choices. But let me be clear, you're not here as a hero or a role model. You're here as a cautionary tale. Can you handle that?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not looking for redemption or forgiveness. I just want to help if I can and complete my service." Led her through the facility, explaining the routines and rules. The shelter housed 60 women on any given night, with services ranging from basic meals and beds to job training and counseling. Sarah would be working in multiple capacities, helping with intake, leading group discussions on navigating social services, and most challenging, sharing her story as a warning about the consequences of desperate choices. Her first day was overwhelming. The women at the shelter looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Word had already spread about who she was, the woman who had pretended to be a Navy SEAL, who had taken benefits meant for real veterans, who had been caught and sent to prison. Some were openly hostile, particularly those who had family members who had served. Others seemed more interested in how she had managed to pull off the deception for so long. During lunch service, Sarah found herself next to a woman in her 40s who had been on the streets for 3 years. Had served in the Army during Desert Storm and wore her veteran status like armor against the indignities of homelessness. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," said, not looking at Sarah as they served soup to the lunch line. "Taking benefits from real veterans while we're out here struggling." Sarah continued ladling soup, accepting the anger. "You're right. I have no defense for what I did. Finally looked at her, surprised by the lack of argument. That's it. No sob story about how hard you had it. I had it hard, Sarah said quietly. But so did you, and you didn't steal valor. So did every woman in this room, and they didn't pretend to be something they weren't. My desperation doesn't excuse what I did. Studied her for a long moment, then went back to serving. They worked in silence for the rest of the shift, but Sarah felt that something had shifted slightly. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but perhaps a small decrease in hostility. That evening, Sarah attended her first group therapy session at her probation-mandated counseling. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, specialized in working with people who had committed fraud and identity-related crimes. The group was small, 5 others besides Sarah, each with their own story of deception and consequence. "Sarah, would you like to share what brought you here?" Dr. Martinez asked, though everyone in the room already knew from the media coverage. Sarah took a breath and began to tell her story, not the practiced version she had told in interviews, but the raw, messy truth. She talked about the fear of sleeping in her car, the gnawing hunger, the invisibility that had eaten away at her sense of self until she was willing to become someone else entirely. "I told myself it was just survival," she said, looking at her hands. "But it became more than that. I became addicted to being seen, to mattering. Every time someone thanked me for my service, I felt like a person again, even though it was based on a lie." A man named Robert, who had impersonated a doctor for years before being caught, nodded in recognition. "The lie becomes more real than your actual life," he said. "You start to believe it yourself." "That's the most dangerous part," Dr. Martinez interjected. "When we begin to believe our own deceptions, we lose touch with who we really are. Sarah, who are you now without the stolen uniform?" It was a question Sarah had been grappling with since her arrest. "I don't know," she admitted. "For months, I was Petty Officer Mitchell, Navy SEAL. Before that, I was nobody. Now I'm the woman who pretended to be a SEAL. I don't know who I am outside of that story." The work in therapy was hard, digging into the childhood trauma and survival mechanisms that had made deception feel like a viable option. Sarah learned about identity formation, about how chronic trauma could fracture a person's sense of self, making it easier to slip into false identities. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped her understand them. 2 weeks into her community service, Sarah was asked to speak at her first school assembly. High school had a strong JROTC program, and the administration thought her story would be a powerful deterrent for students who might be tempted to embellish or lie about military service. Standing backstage in the auditorium, Sarah felt physically ill. She could hear hundreds of teenage voices on the other side of the curtain. In a few minutes, she would have to stand before them and admit to being a fraud, a liar, a thief of honor. Major, the JROTC instructor who had invited her, stood beside her. He was a Marine who had lost his left leg in Afghanistan, and his initial email inviting her to speak had been blunt about his feelings regarding her crime. But he also believed in the power of negative examples. "These kids look up to military service," he said, adjusting his prosthetic leg. "Some of them will enlist. They need to understand that the uniform means something, that it's earned with blood and sweat and sacrifice. Your story shows what happens when someone tries to shortcut that." Sarah nodded, understanding her role. She wasn't here to be sympathized with or understood. She was here to be a warning. When she walked onto the stage, the auditorium fell silent. She could see the JROTC students in their uniforms, sitting with the bearing they were taught. Behind them, regular students watched with curiosity. Some held up phones, probably recording for social media. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "And I'm here to tell you about the worst decision I ever made. I'm here to tell you how I stole something that can't be stolen, only earned. I'm here to tell you why wearing a military uniform you didn't earn is more than just a lie. It's a betrayal of everyone who earned the right to wear it." She told her story without flinching from the ugly parts. The desperation, yes, but also the calculation. The way she had researched military culture like studying for a test. The lies she had told, each one requiring more lies to sustain it. The veterans she had deceived, looking her in the eye and sharing their trauma while she pretended to understand. "I stood at military funerals," she said, her voice breaking. "I watched families bury their heroes while I wore a uniform I bought at a surplus store. I accepted their gratitude for service I never gave. I listened to veterans with PTSD share their darkest moments, believing I understood because I had been through the same hell. I hadn't. I had been through my own struggles, but I had never served a day in my life. She saw some students shifting uncomfortably, others watching with rapt attention. One girl in a JROTC uniform was crying silently, though Sarah couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else. Some of you might be thinking, I would never do that, Sarah continued. And I hope you're right, but I need you to understand how it starts. It starts with a small lie, maybe on a job application, maybe to impress someone. You tell people you were in the military when you weren't, or you inflate your service, claim honors you didn't earn. And because people respect military service, they believe you, they thank you, they treat you differently, and the lie grows. She talked about the consequences, not just the legal ones, though she covered those too. The jail time, the felony record, the restitution she would be paying for years. But more than that, she talked about the personal cost, the loss of identity, the shame that would follow her forever, the knowledge that she had betrayed people who had shown her nothing but trust and respect. Every veteran I meet now has the right to hate me, she said. Every person who thanked me for my service was deceived. Every benefit I received was stolen from someone who had actually earned it. That's what stolen valor means. You're not just lying about yourself, you're stealing from those who sacrificed. During the question and answer period, the students didn't hold back. A young man in JROTC stood up, his voice tight with anger. My brother is a Navy SEAL. He nearly died in training. How dare you wear that trident? Sarah faced him directly. You're right, I had no right. Your brother earned that trident through suffering I can't imagine. I bought mine online for $30. That's the difference between honor and theft. Your anger is justified, and I'm sorry. A girl raised her hand. Do you think you would have done it if there had been better programs to help you when you were homeless? It was a question Sarah had wrestled with. Maybe not, she admitted. But that's not an excuse. There were other options. I could have sought help from legitimate sources. I could have taken any minimum wage job. I chose the lie because it was easier and because I wanted more than just survival. I wanted respect I hadn't earned. After the assembly, Major walked her to her car. That was hard to watch, he said, but it needed to be said. 3 of those kids have parents who are SEALs. 2 have parents who died in service. They needed to hear from someone who violated that sacrifice. Did I do more harm than good? Sarah asked, exhausted from the emotional toll of public confession. Time will tell, the major said. But if even one kid remembers your story when they're tempted to lie about military service, then it was worth it. The school visits became a regular part of Sarah's routine, each one emotionally draining but necessary. She spoke at high schools, colleges, and youth programs. The reactions varied: anger, disgust, sometimes a grudging understanding of how desperation could lead to poor choices. But always, Sarah emphasized that understanding wasn't the same as excusing. At the shelter, her work continued. She helped women navigate the same system she had once defrauded, showing them legitimate resources for housing, food assistance, and job training. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, the woman who had taken shortcuts teaching others the proper path. One evening, she was leading a group discussion on accessing social services when a new resident named spoke up. Was young, maybe 25, and had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been on the streets too long. I've been thinking about saying I'm a veteran, said quietly. Just to get into the better programs, I mean, who would know? The room went silent. Everyone looked at Sarah, waiting to see how the woman convicted of stolen valor would respond. Sarah chose her words carefully. I would know, and eventually others would too. But more importantly, you would know. Every night when you lay down in housing you got through deception, every meal you ate that was meant for someone who served, you would know. And that knowledge will poison everything good that comes from it. She shared more of her story, the specific moments when the weight of the lie had crushed her. The veteran with one leg who had shared his story of loss. The Gold Star mother who had hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for coming home." The young Marine who had saluted her, respect in his eyes for a service she had never performed. It's not worth it, Sarah said firmly. The help you get through lying will never outweigh the cost to your soul, and practically speaking, you will get caught. The military community is smaller than you think, and they protect their own. Someone will ask the right question, want to see the right document, and your whole life will come crashing down. Nodded slowly, seeming to reconsider. After the session, she approached Sarah privately. Were you really going to prison worth it? I mean, you got help when you needed it. Sarah thought about the question seriously. I got 6 months of housing and food through deception, and I'll be paying for it the rest of my life. not just financially, but emotionally and socially. I'm a felon. I'm a pariah in the veteran community. I can never escape what I did, so no, it wasn't worth it. Nothing I gained was worth becoming the person I became. The documentary premiered 3 months after Sarah's release. Tours had created something powerful, not just of Sarah's crime, but an exploration of desperation, identity, and the sacred nature of military service. Sarah watched it at a small screening for the participants, surrounded by some of the veterans who had been interviewed. Seeing herself on screen was surreal. Had included footage from security cameras at various veteran events, showing Sarah in the stolen uniform, accepting handshakes and thanks. He had interviewed the Marine she had comforted, who spoke about his conflicted feelings. He had talked to homeless veterans who were angry that resources meant for them had gone to a fraud. But he had also interviewed Admiral Richardson, who spoke eloquently about redemption and accountability. "She's doing something I rarely see," the Admiral said on screen. "She's facing her crime head-on, not making excuses, and working to ensure others don't make the same mistake. That doesn't erase what she did, but it matters." After the screening, Sarah found herself face-to-face with several of the veterans who had participated. The conversations were awkward and painful. Some refused to speak to her. Others expressed a grudging respect for her willingness to face consequences. One veteran, a former Army sergeant named James, pulled her aside. "I want to hate you," he said bluntly. "What you did was wrong on every level, but I've been watching you at the shelter, hearing about your school talks. You're doing the work. That's more than most people who get caught doing wrong ever do." "It's not enough," Sarah said. "It will never be enough." "No," James agreed, "but it's something." As her community service hours accumulated, Sarah developed a routine. Mornings at the shelter, afternoons often spent speaking at schools or youth programs, evenings in therapy or at probation check-ins. Weekends were for the written component of her service, blog posts and articles about stolen valor, always written from the perpetrator's perspective as a warning to others. One blog post went viral, shared widely in military communities. In it, Sarah had written about the specific moment she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. It was at a Veterans Day ceremony, standing in formation with real veterans, holding a flag she had no right to hold. "I looked around at the men and women beside me," she wrote. "Some were missing limbs, others carried invisible wounds that would never heal. All had sacrificed in ways I could never understand, and there I stood, a fraud among heroes, accepting honor I had stolen. In that moment I hated myself more than I had ever hated anything. But still, I didn't confess. I was too deep in the lie, too addicted to the respect. It would take being caught for me to stop, and that's the most shameful part of all." The responses to the blog were varied and intense. Some veterans expressed appreciation for her honesty. Others told her that no amount of confession would ever make up for her betrayal. Sarah read every comment, absorbing both the support and the condemnation as part of her penance. 6 months into her probation, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. A veterans organization in a neighboring city wanted her to speak at their annual conference, not as a keynote, but as part of a panel on stolen valor. The other panelists would include real veterans, law enforcement officials who investigated such cases, and a psychologist who studied identity fraud. Sarah was terrified. Speaking to high school students was one thing. Facing a room full of veterans, many of whom would rightfully despise her, was another. But she remembered her commitment to accountability and accepted the invitation. The conference was held at a hotel conference center, with hundreds of veterans in attendance. Sarah arrived early, her ankle monitor hidden beneath dress pants, her hands shaking as she sat up at the panel table. The other panelists were professional but cold, clearly uncomfortable sharing a stage with her. The moderator, a retired colonel, introduced her matter-of-factly. "Sarah Mitchell is here as someone convicted of stolen valor. She's completing court-ordered community service by speaking about her crime and its impact. We've included her perspective to help our community better understand and combat this issue." The questions from the audience were brutal. Veterans wanted to know how she could look at herself in the mirror, how she could have accepted thanks for service she never gave, how she could have worn insignia that their brothers and sisters had died earning. Sarah answered honestly, without defensiveness, acknowledging the depth of her betrayal. One moment stood out. A woman in the audience stood up, identifying herself as the widow of a Navy SEAL. "My husband died wearing that trident you bought online," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. He earned it through Hell Week, through deployments where he didn't know if he'd come home. How do you live with yourself? Sarah felt tears running down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood to address the widow directly. I don't have an answer that will satisfy you, she said. I live with it by trying to make sure no one else does what I did. I live with it by facing rooms like this and accepting the anger I deserve. I live with it knowing that I dishonored your husband's sacrifice, and I'm sorry. That's inadequate, but it's all I have. The widow stared at her for a long moment, then sat down without another word. The panel continued, but that exchange hung heavy in the air. After the panel, Sarah was preparing to leave when someone called her name. She turned to find the Gold Star widow waiting for her. The woman said. My husband was Chief Petty Officer David, SEAL Team 5. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she simply waited. I hate what you did, continued. But I've been following your story since your arrest. The speaking, the community service, the documentary. My husband believed in redemption. He believed people could change, could become better than their worst moments. I think he would want me to tell you that your work matters. Not because it excuses what you did, but because it might prevent others from dishonoring service members like him. Sarah broke down completely, overwhelmed by this unexpected grace from someone who had every right to offer only condemnation. Didn't comfort her. That would have been too much to ask. But she stood there until Sarah composed herself. Thank you, Sarah managed to say. I'll keep doing the work for your husband and all the others I dishonored. Nodded and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the empty conference room, feeling the weight of both condemnation and unexpected mercy. As her first year of probation came to an end, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. She was no longer the desperate woman who had put on a stolen uniform, but she wasn't sure who she was becoming. The work continued at the shelter, in schools, through writing and speaking. Her ankle monitor was removed, but the invisible shackles of her crime remained. She had found a small apartment and a job with the nonprofit that worked with homeless women. Her knew her history and had chosen to give her a chance. She spent her free time continuing voluntary service beyond her required hours, driven by a need to balance the scales that could never truly be balanced. One evening, sitting in her apartment, Sarah looked at a photo she kept on her desk. It was from a Veterans Day ceremony she had attended as a fraud, standing among real heroes in her stolen uniform. She kept it as a reminder of who she had been and why she could never stop working to atone. Her phone rang. It was from the shelter. Sarah, I have a woman here who just admitted she's been lying about military service to get benefits. She saw your documentary. She wants to know if there's a way to make it right before she gets caught. Can you come talk to her? Sarah was already reaching for her keys. I'll be right there. This was her purpose now, not redemption, which might never come, but prevention. Every person she stopped from making her mistake, every young person who thought twice before lying about military service, every desperate soul who chose a harder but honest path, that was her service now. Not stolen, but earned through facing the consequences of her actions every single day. As she drove to the shelter, Sarah thought about the journey still ahead. Years of probation remained, thousands more hours of community service, countless more speeches and blogs and difficult conversations. She would never be free of her crime, but she was free of the lie. And in that truth, as painful as it was, she found something she had been searching for all along, not the respect of others, but the possibility of one day respecting herself.